Welcome to our second panel on linkages between citizens and government. I have the sad duty of informing all of us that Dan Gillion won't be able to join us today. I gather that his flight was delayed or canceled or something along those lines, so he won't be able to make it in time for today's presentation. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to keep all the panelists to the allocated 10 minutes for their presentations and reserve the extra time for more questions. I'd also like to invite sort of different voices from the crowd. So those of you who are interested in sharing your thoughts, not just on this particular panel, but on issues that have been brought up and haven't had a chance to raise your hand, please start thinking of your questions now and raise those hands as soon as we open up for questions, and I'll make sure to identify you, and we can go that way. Our first presenter is Lee Drutman from New America.
All right.
So you'll have 10 minutes, and I'm gonna treat you like you treated me.
Okay. Well, hey, that was just informed to be treated that. All right. Is there a presentation here? All right. Here we have it. Okay. Great. So we'll start with the good news. The good news. This is from a new report that I put out as part of the voter study group with Larry Diamond and Joe Goldman. And the good news is that support for a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with Congress and elections actually went down. This is actually at levels that we haven't seen since the mid-90s. So maybe good news. But we also, in this report, we also looked at 5 world value surveys questions. And so across all 5 questions, only 54% of survey respondents said that in all questions gave the pro-democratic response. Now, so I don't want to get too caught up in the ups and downs of these polls. We're actually doing more recent polling, but I do want to step back and think of a broader historical scope here. So we might ask, well, hasn't there always been a sizable slice of the American electorate who holds anti-democratic attitudes? And the answer is yes. Certainly this was. Hold that for a second. Certainly that was the dispiriting finding of many social scientists in the 1950s and 1960s, when American scholars asked whether it could happen here, with the it being the rise of Hitler or equivalent, and they probed the deaths of the American citizenry, and the answer seemed to be, well, yes, it could. So I'll show you 2 more tables from the report, now neither of which would be surprising to the mid-century scholars of American authoritarianism. One is that if you think that being of European heritage is important to being American, you are quite likely to think that we should have a strong leader, and democracy might not always be preferable. Also, if you have a high perception of your community is in disorder, i.e. American carnage, you also think a strong leader might be a good thing. So what was it that kept American democracy stable, at least at the national level, in an earlier era? So probably a couple explanations. Part of it might be that the authoritarian enclaves in the South were allowed to persist independently, so those attitudes and concerns were not really mobilized into national partisan conflict in the way that they are now. Part of it, frankly, had to do with the quality of elites, who have always been the bulwark and the teachers of American liberal democratic traditions, and maybe we just got lucky. And part of it, a lot of it, I think, is the party system itself, in which there was no party that was the single home of the congery of attitudes that cohere around authoritarianism. So I'm going to ask the big question here, and one that I think we need to wrestle with, which is, can the 2-party system handle Trump and Trumpism? And if not, what do we do about that? So I'm going to harken back to everybody's favorite 1950 pamphlet, I want to flip ahead to the final page of that pamphlet, which actually contains this really dire warning. It's this the sort of dangers of what happens if we don't take action. And number 4 is the danger of an unbridgeable political cleavage, which is like eerily prescient. And I'll just read, this is an extended quote, but I think it's worth working through. Is, quote, if the 2 parties do not develop alternative programs that can be executed, the voters' frustration and the mounting ambiguities of national policy might also set in motion more extreme tendencies to the political left and the political right. This, again, would represent a condition to which neither our political institutions, that's important, nor our civic habits, important, are adapted. Once a deep political cleavage develops between opposing groups, each group naturally works to keep it deep. Such groups may gravitate beyond the confines of the American system of government and its democratic institutions. Assuming the survival of the two-party system in form, though not in spirit, even if one of the diametrically opposite parties comes to flirt with unconstitutional means and ends, consequences would be serious. For then, this is the optimistic part, the constitution-minded electorate would be virtually reduced to a one-party system with no practical alternative to holding the safe party at all costs. And this is, that's optimistic. I think that everybody would cohere into the pro-constitution party. Now, as we all know, in line with the advice of the political scientists writing this report, that two parties did develop into two alternative programs. Problem is with the programs that can be executed. Now, in 1950, we had overlapping parties. Now we have non-overlapping parties, but we didn't get, quote, executable programs. Instead, our system of checks and balances and decentralized authority, which is designed to specifically prevent against the tyranny of the majority. In that system, polarized parties just have given us gridlock and a steady erosion of procedural consensus with mounting frustration. Now, again, while this APSA report is, optimistic that most American voters will pick the safe party, I'm less confident that the American electorate is as constitution-minded as they claimed it was. Now, in the report, this voter study group report, we broke down voters based on their attitudes on cultural issues and economic issues based on a series of questions and an index I constructed. And we looked at how those attitudes corresponded with attitudes towards democracy. Now, so what you see here, which is actually, I think, quite interesting, is that voters who are in the kind of oft-mentioned positions are least supportive of democracy. Now, part of that may be that they're less educated, less engaged in politics. Generally, they don't know what they're supposed to think as coherent ideologies. But part of it may be that they feel that there's nothing in the system that represents them. So, of course, it's a terrible system. We also had Obama-Trump voters who really stand out as thinking a strong leader is good. Also, people who didn't voted for a third party or not at all in the previous cycle. Also, very high, strong leaders. So the question is, all right. So what do we do about this? Now, one conventional wisdom is, well, we should just spend more time on civic education and do what we can to expand voter participation, which sounds nice, and civic education is a good thing, and I'm all for it. But I think one of the challenges is we need to think about this more. If we're asking for more engagement for people who feel unconnected to the system and feel the system doesn't represent them or hold negative views of democracy, two risks. One is that we're bringing more people into the system with anti-democratic views, which further increases the electoral power of an anti-system populist candidate who promises to blow it all up. Second is we just produce more strong partisan voters, which makes partisan polarization worse. And then I think there's an even bigger problem. A lot of people are very optimistic that Democrats will win the midterms in 2021. But what happens? That means if Democrats do this, it means that they've converted a lot of the more constitutionally minded Republicans into being Democrats. And then what are we left with as the Republican Party? This gets to the question of what is the Republican Party? And if the Republican Party without Eliot Cohen and other sober-minded people, that's the party of Ted Cruz and Steve King and Roy Moore and Louis Gohmert. And that's when I think things really get ugly. And maybe that's already what the Republican Party is. So then, if we have a two-party system, and that's the axis of conflict, is ethno-nationalism versus pluralism, is respect for liberal democratic norms, or sort of a voter suppression and just anti-constitutionalism. How do we shift the axis of political conflicts back away from this battle over the nature of American identity and the nature of American democracy, and back to a more non-existential, what we might call normal politics argument over public policy and its implementation? And maybe we never had that, but it's clear that the current party system and the current party conflict is just deadly to American democracy. And I think we really need to think hard about how we might scramble the current party system so that being a Democrat or being a Republican is not wrapped up in these fundamental zero-sum questions about the basis of American democracy. And in the interest of time, that's where I'll leave it. cliffhanger.
Next, I'll introduce Matt Levendusky from Penn. Matt, you also have 10 minutes.
Okay, great, thanks. Sorry, how do I pull up my slides? There we go, thanks. All right, great, thanks so much for having me. So I wanted to begin with a puzzle, right? So there's 60 years worth of research now showing that the mass media really are crucial to democracy. I won't belabor this point too much for this audience, but we know they play this critical role in informing the public, in preventing corruption, especially through investigative journalism, and keeping members of Congress in line with their district sentiment, right? And on one hand, sorry, you can't really see this, on the left-hand panel, we have how important people think the news media is to democracy, and basically everyone says, oh, it's incredibly important, right? Like 80% of people say it's either extremely or very important. But then if you ask people, how well do you think democracy, or how well is the media doing to serve democracy, right? Most people think it's doing not very well at all. Right, so there's this tension there, sort of a recognition by both scholars and the public that media are really crucial, but the sort of belief, in some ways I think a belief that's not wholly unjustified, that the media is not doing that job, right? So I wanted to take my time today to think about 3 empirical challenges that in some ways intersect with Trump, but long predate him as well. Right. So the 3 things I'll talk are a little bit about media trust and partisanship, what the financial model for local news is, and how we think about regulating the media environment. So the first one, right, is this whole argument about media trust and partisanship. That there's a lot of discussion about the way Trump hollowed out Republican support for the news media. I'll show you some evidence that's sort of true in a minute, but it's also, oops, sorry, I did these. That we missed the most important figure. Okay, sorry. The most important figure seems to have been dropped from the presentation, so you just get to hear me describe it, which is a figure from the GSS data showing media trust broken down by party, and basically Democrats are always higher than Republicans, but the difference is really small until the mid-90s. It's like 4 points or something like that. Starting in the 90s, you get this really big gap, right? And even pre-Trump, the last GSS was done in the spring of 2016, you see this big, 30-some point gap. And so now you can see, can't really see it on the screen, right? But now there are these much bigger gaps, 2016 to 2017, right? Trump kind of further exacerbated those trends, but it's important to note that this isn't, the Trump effect here is small, right? Relative to what happened before, right? Trump, he might be the apotheosis, I can never say that word, apotheosis of the trend, right? But he's not sui generis, right? He is very much, right, just taking what came before and just pushing it a little bit further. So in some ways, right, I don't know how you put that genie back in the bottle, right? That in some ways, I think we're already kind of coming back to this model of a press that is that kind of brief window of mid-century high-trust press, right, that's sort of credible and neutral. I just don't see how you get back there. And I think, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A if you're interested. This is also a case where I think everything we know about motivated reasoning, partisan bias, right, lead me to think as a political psychologist that even if you could tell people, these are the facts, right, everything we know about the way people process that information in light of their prior beliefs, it's real tough for me to see how, even if you could fiat that world into existence, right, how you actually get that to behave in the way you'd like it to. I think it's better trying to think about how you come to grips with a world where, like we had for much of the U.S. history, right, the news is not a sort of objective truth. The second thing is that I worry a lot about the model for local news. So we've heard a number of times now how well the New York Times is doing, how well the Washington Post is doing, and that's great, right? The New York Times made over $1 billion last year. Largely that's due to a huge growth in online subscription models, right? That those 2 papers, as well as the Wall Street Journal, have figured out the paywall model really effectively. So that's great, and they're doing lots of really great national reporting. But if you look, so this is from the Center for Effective Public Management in Brookings, right? You can see that circulation per capita for newspapers has fallen. Total circulation has fallen, right? Since 2014, it's fallen further. And what's really happened now is that local news, which is super important for a bunch of reasons we'll get back to in a minute, has been more or less completely hollowed out. I think that part of the story that we've missed is the hedge fundification of these newspapers. So I grew up in a household that was really obsessed with Warren Buffett. So both of my brothers work in financial sales. And my dad was, even though he's an engineer, was really obsessed with Warren Buffett. So if you have read the Berkshire Hathaway, by the way, no one had the money to buy Berkshire Hathaway when I was growing up, but we just read the newsletter, right? So if you read for a long time, like Warren talked every year and Charlie Munger talked every year in the letter about how they own this big stake in the Washington Post, and this was like, you were never going to get rich off of owning a newspaper, but it was this kind of solid return. That all starts to change in the 1990s and early 2000s, right? Hedge funds start buying up a lot of these papers, and they do exactly what they do everywhere else, which is they saddle the companies with tons of debt, and they cut staffs pretty dramatically, so you lead to seeing things like this. So this is the Denver Post. This is their front page last Sunday. So the bottom is they won a Pulitzer Prize in 2014 for effective reporting, right? The black are all the people that have been fired since then, right? And so this is just one particular example, right? There was something similar in the Boston Globe recently where they said, short of being set on fire, being bought by a hedge fund is the next worst thing that can happen to a paper. And the reason this matters, right, is that we know from the work of people like Jen Lawless and Danny Hayes, and also my student Josh Darr and Katie Surlis, that these things are really crucial to political participation, right? That these local papers and local TV news, and so if you saw the great paper that Greg Martin had at the MPSA on the Sinclair takeover, right, it's not so much that they slant the news, it's that they substitute national news for local news, right? And that's really key because you can get national news lots of places, right? I can read, Politico online, I can, get the feed from the New York Times and the Washington Post, but if I don't get local news from a local newspaper or a local TV station, I'm not getting it, right? So all those things about holding your member of Congress to account, knowing something about city council, knowing things about corruption in local communities, if that doesn't come from local news, I don't know where it comes from. And so, the question is, what's the revenue model? So the Rupert Murdoch suggestion is that we should have Facebook and Twitter cost sharing effectively, that basically Facebook and Twitter have sort of grown up, right? Basically taking content from other people, and they should be charged effectively basically a reproduction fee, right? So that every time they want to link to something, that they have to pay some cost for that, and then you somehow do some sort of cost sharing that supports local journalism. It's a good idea in theory. How you achieve that in practice, I have no idea, right? And that kind of connects then with the last point that I want to make is how do we think about regulation in this new world, right? So for a long time, when I teach Intro to America and we get to the section on like the media, right, like being a media scholar, I never want to talk about the boring regulation, part of it. And 10 years ago, right, maybe I thought that mattered less, but now I've actually started thinking a lot more about this and how do you use regulatory tools to try and reshape the media environment in productive ways, right? And in particular, right, like how do we think about how all these new things are media and how do we regulate them? So I actually thought the most important thing, it didn't get a lot of press, but the most important thing out of Zuckerberg's testimony before Congress was he more or less admitted that they're a news organization, right? Before Facebook, if you ever looked at any of their public statements, vehemently denied any connection. They basically said, no, we're this way for you to know what your cousin is doing and what the person who you had a crush on in high school, what her kids look like, but they basically now admitted that they're a content provider, right? And so I think, we have to think really hard about what that means. So I don't even pretend to know how to use Snapchat, but my students tell me that's important now, right? How do we think about all of these things? How do we think about regulating them? And how do we bring back, right, an environment where at least people are capable of getting that information? So sorry, that's super depressing, and I have no answers to any of those things, but more just kind of things to think about.
Our discussant is Nick Vanderwall from Cornell.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much to the organizers. I'm very pleased to be here, and I look forward to listening to the discussion and learning from it. I apologize I wasn't here yesterday. I was teaching a class on African politics yesterday afternoon. Trump is often said to be in Africa, the first really African president. They don't buy at all the fact that Obama was an African president. And they don't usually mean that in a positive way. So I want to start with a comparative anecdote from the French election of about a year ago. A week before the election, I watched in great dread. It was 3 months after the Clinton-Trump debates. I watched the debate between Marine Le Pen and Emmanuel Macron in a situation where all of the momentum seemed to be on the Le Pen and National Front side, and Macron's soaring popularity numbers had started to inch downwards. Le Pen sneered and pandered her way through the debate. If they had been allowed to stand and walk around the stage, I don't doubt that she would have peered over Macron's shoulder in much the way that Trump did over Clinton's shoulder. Macron showed a somewhat school-marmish command of the issues. He was humorless. And I remember watching the debate and saying, oh no, this is déjà vu all over again. She's going to do to him exactly what Trump did to Clinton in the debates. And in fact, it turned out, and I think experts agree, that it was a turning point in the French election. She was widely viewed as having really very much lost the election and had shown no command of the issues. And this was devastating for her. And in the end, she came 6-7 percentage points below what she had been forecast to come. Now, to be sure, most of those votes didn't go to Macron, but in a classic French way, she lost support to the end to the left and to La France Insoumise, which is a left-wing party historically to the left of the Communist Party, and one which in fact was closest to her party in terms of policies. So why did her command of the issues, her lack of command of the issues, prove so devastating and not devastating to Trump? I would posit 4 sort of theories. One is that there was a really broad consensus among what Lee called, or citing Herb McCluskey, the articulate classes, about what was a kind of an acceptable level of policy knowledge. And she was viewed, and it was asserted repeatedly on television that she lacked that command. Even though I would say that her command of the issues was much better in the debates than Trump's. A more disciplined, more regulated press also announced unequivocally and without spinning that she had lost the debate and had demonstrated a lack of command over the issues. Thirdly, and sort of third theory about what happened, a more discerning public with itself a greater command of the issues and more knowledge of the issues also viewed that as really disqualifying for her. And I guess fourthly, and coming back to La France Insoumise and Mélenchon, there was an alternative, a policy alternative to her that the two-party system in the U.S. did not give the people who were unwilling to vote for Clinton. Okay. Am I comparing the modern Republican Party to the National Front in France? Well, let's be clear. I think in terms of a lot of policies, there's difference, right? In terms of the impact on the topic of this conference of democratic backsliding, attitudes towards non-democratic institutions, authoritarian rhetoric and tendencies, I would say there's a lot less difference than than one would care to say. The biggest difference is that the Republican Party is an insider party in the U.S. It is in power. It's in the halls of government at the local level, whereas the National Front is classically an outsider party and has been essentially, other than one or two mayoralities, has been left out of power entirely, as indeed has most of the far right in Europe. I think in terms of the dynamics of backsliding, that this insider-outsider distinction is important and suggests the different natures of protest and of paths to a real scenario of backsliding. So I start with that anecdote to talk about really the making of public opinion and this relationship that all three of the papers discuss between the citizenry and government. So on the decline of the media, I'm a bit more sanguine than Matt is, I think. I think the paradox that he puts his finger on and that I think needs to be addressed is that the news to me, has never been as plentiful, cheap, accessible, and cosmopolitan than it's ever been. I mean, I think most of us would agree that the ability to, check quickly The Guardian and the New York Times online, and then, go see Vox and what Matthew Iglesias is up to, and then, and then listen to, Rush Limbaugh on the radio. And I mean, it's easy to get a lot of information. But I'm a discerning professional political scientist, and the paradox is that despite all this information, the American public, because I don't think this is true necessarily elsewhere, the American public has never been as ignorant and gullible as it is today. And that, it seems to me, is distinctly an American dimension to this issue of backsliding. I agree about the need, secondly, for more effective regulation. I'm not sure why it eludes the US, and I think the failure to regulate this new news environment is pretty similar to the general failure of regulation in the US. And I would see two causes to it. One is, as always, the power of special interests and the power to defend the status quo that these special interests have. And secondly, the lack of an elite consensus on the nature of the regulation, right? With an insider party, directly preventing intelligent regulation. So that leads me to a quick comment about Gillion's paper, which makes a defense, a rousing defense of the constitutive power of protest, and I think that's true. Let me take another French example, though, and that is the aftermath of the May '68 protest, which shows that protest, if it's not harnessed to insider politics, doesn't necessarily amount to much. And Charles de Gaulle emerged victorious from the May '68 protests, at least temporarily. The one success of the May '68 protests, if we exclude the fact that the dorms in Parisian universities became co-ed soon thereafter, the main triumph was the Cornell Accords, which was a labor accord, and labor was the one organized group which had been ambivalent about the protests, but rode on their coattails to push an agenda through. The other thing that I guess I'll end with is that the other thing that happened after '68 in Europe was the rise of an illiberal left that was very, very dissatisfied with the actions of protest and led directly to the violence of the Red Brigades Action Directe and the Baader-Meinhof gang. And it seems to me that as we talk about the next phase, I think we should worry both about the illiberal right, the rise of, I guess the other example would be, the Tea Party has not really amounted to all that much except to create space for the militia movement in the West. I think we should be very worried about illiberal groups in the aftermath of the 2018 elections. I had some comments on Matt's paper, but they're more specific, and I'll give them to him specifically. Thank you.
All right. So thanks to the panelists and to Nick for his comments. We have about half an hour for comments and questions, and so what I'll do is just open it up. Remember, I'm looking for voices I haven't heard much from yet. We'll start with Kim.
Yeah, thanks. So thanks a lot to all three panelists. Really interesting comments. Really quite depressing, I think, in some sense. So one of the lessons that I took from that is that, at least in the context of a two-party system like the United States, if we struggle to get facts to voters because local media is dead and we know the problems with real facts coming out through Twitter and Facebook and so forth, if American exceptionalism plays out such that American voters are particularly ignorant and gullible, which I think was Nick's term, and if we actually can't change minds with facts anyway, as the political psychologists tell us, the logical conclusion here is really that voters can't be counted on to save democracy, right? And then it seems like the next step of that is the statement that the solution here is really the authoritarian enforcement of democratic norms. And I just want to leave you just kind of thinking about that as a tension about how we save democracy by basically overriding this tendency among voters to go toward an authoritarian path.
Is that a question? Or is that a provocation?
For the panelists
Yeah.
to wax eloquent.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And there's no easy answers. I mean, I think democracy has always, I think you're right. I mean, the voters are not going to save us because they look to the elites to think how to make sense of politics. They look to what they read in the media, and they look to what people are saying on television. And if Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity are telling them that the FBI is illegitimate, then okay, well, that's what it means to be a Republican. Ultimately, I think it relies on the way that elites conduct political contestation and competition. And right now, we have one party that has just broken all the rules of how you're supposed to do that in a liberal democracy. And until that changes, I'm deeply pessimistic about what happens next. So, anything to add?
Yeah, I'll just add one sort of quick thing that maybe is we'll say a soupçon, to continue with the French theme, of hope. So with some comparative colleagues, I did a bunch of survey experiments last year because we saw the same world value series questions, and we were sort of concerned about that. So, but I've never quite understood what those world value study questions are supposed to mean. Like, what does it mean to okay, so I like a strong leader if I'm frustrated because, gridlock is happening, but that doesn't mean I want, Viktor Orban or something. So we posed people a bunch of specific scenarios, and in some ways the most stunning thing about getting all the results back is that people really resisted what you might think of as democratic encroachment. So we base them off of real scenarios. So, for example, cases in like the case in North Carolina where the executive tries to take away some of the power of the court, or in Vermont where the governor tries to basically pack the court in favor of his party. And that, yes, you get this standard thing where we like it a little more if our party does it, a little less if the other party does it. But overall, the basic message was people are like, no, this is bad, this is wrong, don't do this. So I think there's maybe more support there, than we think. I always think back to the first place I ever learned about these sort of differences was thinking about the McCarthy scandal. And yes, it's true that elites were more supportive than the public. But remember that no elites really spoke out against McCarthy until it was pretty clear that it was safe to do so. So yes, I'm a student of Paul Snyderman, so I think that it is elites that provide the structure within which ordinary voters operate. But ordinary voters, actually, I'm willing to give them maybe a little more credit than we sometimes do.
So I have Larry next on my list.
Which I think is entirely reasonable. I think it's a view, it's widely held, and I think Kim expressed it in a much more intelligent way than often is the case. But I want to take a different perspective, which is there's a lot of research showing that groups of individuals reason in a fairly rational way. There's work by Kevin Esterling and colleagues. I did a book on kind of mass deliberation called Talking Together with several colleagues. Ben Page and Bob Shapiro have written about the rational public. And so to me, it's contestable whether, in fact, the public is gullible and ignorant. I think that is, in my view, not supported by the research. It is, a kind of ad hominem comment. So then the question is, how did it end up that way? Because I take to be the case that you can see symptoms of that. And I think the evidence here, and Matt kind of gently alluded to it, is the impact of elites. And on this issue, whether it's motivated reasoning or framing of various sorts, there I think that's the culprit. So if you're thinking about kind of the way back to democracy, it's not to say that citizens have been tested and failed. It's rather to look at the institutions and the elites and say, what's going on here that our information environment and the nature of our elite class is so corrupt. It's so engaged in outright lying and manipulation. That, to me, is a real issue. Now, I would just say, by way of still an alternative way to think about this, Suzanne Mettler and I have been, I would say, heroically out doing a panel study. I'm looking for Suzanne because she might agree with me on that characterization. We've been doing a panel study, started it just as the Affordable Care Act was being designed, and we said, we got to go in the field and see how people respond and change. So the same set of people being interviewed again and again, and what we found, and we've done 4 waves now into 2016, is that the personal experience of getting insurance or having the individual or someone in their family get a subsidy, get a senior member of their household getting assistance, has impacted their evaluation of the impact of this law. This is now extending to people who were initially favoring repeal of the law. So there's something going on there that suggests something that's not gullible or ignorant or kind of authoritarian. People are learning from their own lived experience. So that's another provocation or perspective.
So next on the list, I have glasses in the back. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Yes.
Jason Zengerle with the New York Times Magazine. I had a question for Matt about whether the decline in trust in media, if you think it's related at all to the decline of local media. I think reporters like to tell themselves that one of the reasons people don't trust us is because they don't know us. It's really easy to hate a Washington Post reporter or a New York Times reporter who, parachutes in, but harder to hate a Toledo Blade reporter that, maybe your kid goes to school with. At the same time, I feel that these newspapers were often dismissed as liberal institutions by their local readers. There was always some sort of criticism of them. But I'm wondering if you see any linkage between, in the 90s, these local papers getting eviscerated by hedge funds, and at the same time, the gap that started to grow then between Republicans and Democrats in terms of how they trusted the press.
Yeah, it's a little hard to assess causality, in any of these sort of things with just parallel time series. But I think part of what we should understand is those measures of media trust, in part what they pick up is not so much that people don't trust the media, but that Republican voters have learned that what it means to be a Republican is to say you don't like the press because the press is biased against Republicans. Because if you ask people, do you like what paper what do you use? Do you trust that? They say, oh yes, right? And so that, the relationship there is the media, some kind of like nebulous concept out there. I think there are other things like, as other folks have talked about, the tabloidification of the news, the rush towards sensationalism, negativity, right? Those also play a factor. But I think you're right that there probably is some effect of people who are embedded within local communities and, speaking to those communities that breeds a different kind of trust. So maybe that's one more reason to think that these sorts of things matter.
Next on the list, I have Jamila.
Okay, so this is actually a good connection to my question, which is, primarily directed at you, Lee, but anyone can answer. So during your presentation, you offered this really, to me, it was a provocative problem as a scholar of, among other things, political participation, where you said, you know, sure, in an ideal world, we want to incorporate more people into the electorate, but if we do that, we may end up incorporating these low information voters that might further polarize the electorate or that might make an authoritarian leader like Trump more appealing or have more political support. And I've thought about this a bit, right? Because, and it connects to the sort of the issue that Kim laid out, which is there a scenario under which we should just be realist and want to see less political incorporation? But the one thing that mitigates against that for me, and I guess the thing that, at least until this very most recent question, feels like it's missing from the conversation is a focus not on elites, but on non-elites, right? So when I think about what kind of incorporation might actually be a sort of countervailing incorporation, that we're just not incorporating low-income, or not low-income, low-information voters who don't know anything are gonna polarize the electorate. But what does it mean to take those low-information voters and actually sort of inform them or expand their horizons or include them in a way that's more robust, that's not just going to end up creating outcomes that we're not interested in seeing? And when I think about how that kind of thing can happen, a lot of the mechanisms that I imagine don't have anything to do with elites, right? Those mechanisms are super local. It's about what's going on in local public schools or in other local public institutions, and it's about civil society, and it's about grassroots organizations. So it feels like a lot of the emphasis is on parties and elites, right? And that leads us down this road that is super depressing, and actually I'm not optimistic at all. So that's appropriate in many ways. But I wonder if the story that you tell, Lee, is missing a lot because you're not thinking about local institutions and civil society and more sort of grassroots elements. And I wonder if there's a reason why you're not talking about that, if there's a principled reason why you don't see much hopefulness there. Although, again, I'm not really a fan of hopefulness.
All right. Well, I mean, also, yeah. I mean, more broadly, I am thinking about that, and I mean, I think one of the things that's happened, with our political organizations and with our political parties, and both Danny Schlossman and Theda Skocpol have written eloquently on this, is they've become national institutions that are really quite removed from people. So they're not. The classic, view of political participation in political science is that people participate because there are organizations and structures to bring them in and incorporate them, and there just aren't those structures in the way that there were. I mean, labor unions have vanished from a lot of places. A lot of community organizations are really gone. So yeah, I mean, I think we certainly would have a more vital democracy if those institutions existed and brought people into politics and gave them a sense of voice and a sense of that what they do actually matters. Now, I mean, how to rebuild that? I mean, that is a gargantuan task. Now, well, I hope that continues. So I mean, then a more broader comparative perspective, and is the fact that we have a two-party system, which means that in most places elections don't matter because either it's a Democratic place or a Republican place, so most people votes essentially don't matter. Parties don't invest. I mean, you look comparatively, countries with multi-party systems have much higher voter participation rates. Now, why is that? Part of it is that people are more likely to see candidates who they think represent them. Parties and candidates have much more interest in engaging a broader slice of the electorate. Also, it's also hard to register to vote in the U.S. comparatively to other countries. So, I mean, that's a whole other set of issues. And because of the way that our partisan competition is set up, you have one party who actually wants to shrink the electorate because they know if the electorate expands, then they're toast. So that is also an element of our current partisan competition. So, I mean, there are a lot of issues there. You might have something to say on the comparative.
Yeah, just a comment on the party system. I mean, this is not true of France, but in other countries which use proportional representation, not only do you have more options for parties and for citizens and citizens with very specific preferences, but in addition, you don't have the link at the local level between the politician and his or her constituency, because it's a national list, right? And so that kind of and since the far right and democratic backsliding, there's been less of that in these societies. Your argument about those linkages at the local level, I think, don't really work all that well for Northern Europe.
Yeah, that's fair.
Next on the list, I have Rob Mickey.
Thanks. So this just brings back to mind the movie History of the World Part 1, when Count de Money, played by Harvey Korman, runs up to the king and says, "Sir, the people are revolting," and the king says, "No kidding, they stink on ice." I think this view sums up not necessarily what you all are saying, but a lot of the responses to 2016. Yasha Monk's new book, of course, is called "The People versus Democracy," as if there's something wrong with the people. I was just wondering if you all could discuss a little bit elite commitments to democracy. The APD side of your project is in large part a compilation of evidence of elite opposition to, or at best ambivalence about, democratic rule. And so I think this connects to, Matt, you alluded to Snyderman's work, right? And he writes about elite support for democracy being conditional on party competition. That connects with what you were talking about, Lee, with the party system. But I think we need to think about what party organizations, what mass mobilizations can do to convince elites to support democracy, not merely the other way around.
Jump in on that? All right. Yeah. No. I mean, I think that's I mean, look, the history of democratization in the U.S. has been bottom up largely, right? If you go back to the original design of the Constitution, the elites who wrote the Constitution sort of wanted to keep the people at bay. They didn't really trust the people. Sort of series of mass popular movements that expanded, by democratization I mean expanded public participation. But I think this is a tension that was in the Constitution, and it's a tension that's always been with us, is trying to find the right balance between elite judgment and popular rule. I don't think we've ever gotten that balance right. And part of it, I mean, I go back to the point that Tom made in his comments, which is that elites want democracy to the extent that they want to have an opportunity to be around next time. Now, I mean, Rob, you read about the South, where elites basically perpetrated one-party rule, so there was no sense of threat that they might be out of power. I mean, but a party system, I think, depends on there being a sort of balance between elites who recognize the value of the perpetuity of the system and have trust of the people at some level. But do we want pure popular democracy? I mean, nobody wants direct democracy. So I think the history of democracy is essentially a struggle between those two instincts, that we don't trust the people entirely because popular, pure, direct democracy, it sort of is based on this idea of sort of unity. I mean, that the people, never agree, and they don't understand that they don't agree, and the sort of the James Morone democratic wish idea. But we also don't want pure, elite rule either. So it's a tension. I don't have a great answer. I think we've constantly struggled with it.
One thing I might add to that is that I am less bothered by the observation that many Americans support strong leaders and other democratic things, just simply because we don't live in a world in which that's the choice that they face, right? And so you can think of that as a good thing or a bad thing. The source of the end of democracy by elections in the United States is a story in which people don't intend to vote for the end of democracy, but they do so by accident. Right? Next on my list is Val.
Even in Weimar, they didn't think they were ending democracy when they voted for Hitler. But okay, I wanted to kind of highlight Russian public opinion, just briefly do an overview of its structure, because it's part of this discussion and partly not in terms of kinds of questions asked, but also the interesting kind of disconnects that you see. Okay, first of all, there's strong support for a strong leader, and that goes up every time there's a crisis, real or fabricated. Secondly, Russians are fairly liberal in terms of support of civil liberties and political rights. Yes, that's not changed much at all since the early 90s. Third, they see the certain limits on attacks on democracy. There are lines that are crossed. And that happened when, for example, Russians see that elections are manipulated, that there's intervention. They have very strong reactions to that. That's when you get the protests. Fourth, they see Putin as a temporary move in an authoritarian direction that was needed. They see it, though, as temporary. We'll ratchet back and return to a more authentic democracy when we can afford to do so. Now, they don't see him as authoritarian as many of us in this room would, or certainly I would. But the point is that they really see it as a temporary thing, and then you could get back to a more democratic order. Finally, they do not rate Putin highly on virtually anything. Policies, how effective he is at governing, blah, blah, blah. He has very low scores. He's had very low scores for 15 years.
How about horseback riding? Pretty good?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's very interesting because one conclusion one could draw, which I think is a fair conclusion about this situation, is that there just isn't anyone else. Now, Putin's been good at getting rid of other else's, right? But the point is there isn't anyone else. And, Adam Jaworski said a long time ago when he was writing on solidarity, going back to his Polish roots, he said, politics changes when political alternatives present themselves. What's not happened in the Russia case, although Navalny may do it. I'm really saying that don't imagine, for example, that one strong leader means some other kinds of things. You can't imply that. And secondly, I think that you still have a pretty democratic Russian public, in fact, and you've got this obviously authoritarian leader. Thanks.
Well, that's precisely why the party system matters, because it generates the alternatives. So, yes, agree.
Next on my list, I have the first Sid. Then the next Sid is several people down. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Briefly on public opinion, I want to cite the work of somebody who's in the room. Paul, where are you? Paul Pearson's work on the policy state, and of course Suzanne's work on feedback from policy. I really think political science in this country has gone overboard with rebuilding the field around public opinion polling. It allots to voters an autonomy that history shows that they seldom have. Now, I know a case where public opinion did matter a lot. Italy in 1919 expanded the suffrage by 40%, and that was one of the reasons Mussolini came to power. But nobody's talking about bringing Catholic women and poor illiterate peasants into the electorate. If we do increase the size of the electorate, it will be a marginal increase, and it will be on the part of voters who have a reasonable amount of sophistication. Second, on the media, I want to cite someone whose name hasn't come up yet and probably should, and that's Paul Starr, his book on the birth of the American media. And what Paul shows, among other things, is that the media has almost always been partisan. That's been the rule of media, and we've had a very short period where the goal of the objective media tended to govern, at least normatively, media behavior. That we are moving towards a partisanized media is normal for a period of political polarization. And what's not normal, or at least what's unusual, is the combination of the movementalization of the media with digitalization. Now, I'm not a digital maniac, and I don't think digital communication is going to transform everything. But there have been moves, particularly since Trump's election, but even further, towards the creation of what we might call institutionalized or quasi-institutionalized media. I want to cite the work of David Karpf, who wrote the best book that I know of on Move On, and who has now written a fascinating article in a forthcoming book co-edited by myself called The Origins of the Anti-Trump Resistance. And in that article, he describes 3 or 4 different media organizations that are quasi-movements, but which are extremely skilled in mediating between internal traditional institutions and the new electorate, the new activism that's arisen since Trump's election. We are certainly clear that traditional American institutions are in decline, both organizationally and in terms of public opinion support. But what we need to do is ask ourselves the question whether new institutions are in the making, and some of these new institutions may be taking the form of these new movementalized media organizations. Thanks.
Any response from the panelists? Next, I have Adam.
Yeah, so this question is, I guess, in part for Lee, but I would love to hear anybody else's thoughts. We all study politics, and so we know that we believe it's important. We know the ways in which it's important for people's lives. But I didn't grow up in a political family at all, or academic family, or anything like that. And so, I sort of grew up with politics as a bit of a sideshow, and I think that's true for a lot of people. The things that they really kind of care about, they care about good health, they care about jobs, they care about making sure that their loved ones are taken care of, safety, things like that. And so on the one hand, I sort of definitely agree that calls for civic education often seem sort of vague or uncertain, and it's unclear what the payoff of that would be and how that would do in a cost-benefit analysis, so to speak. But yet, when I go off, and because politics nowadays particularly is often just about people in conflict, people in a city far away yelling at each other. But yet, when I go and I interview people who are members of civic associations, even people who are sort of, highly advantaged in terms of, SES and, income, education, all that kind of stuff, they will routinely say things like, oh, wow, now I see how politics matters to me. Now I sort of feel like I have a voice and things like that. And so it seems like there's a lot of civic education that's happening there that is, pretty specific and pretty powerful. So anyway, I'm just sort of curious, I'm sort of trying to unpack what, how to understand sort of, what I'm observing in these associations around the country. With sort of calls saying more civic education might not be the best idea.
I'm for civic education. I think people, it's a basic life skill. You should know, if you live in democracy, you should know how that system works. Just like people should also understand how investing works, and these are other things that people don't understand. So I guess the question is what would be different if people knew more about how our political system worked? I don't know. There's a lot of crazy Republicans who know a lot about politics, who, because they follow Fox News and listen to Rush Limbaugh, and they have all kinds of ideas, even though they may have gotten a civic education. So that's what you can know basic skills. There are a lot of people who know certain things, and then the information environment that they surround themselves with pulls them in a very different direction. So ultimately, I think a lot of it comes down to the alternatives and the party competition that people see when they consume and engage in politics. And people come to their own opinions in some sense, but there are alternatives and narratives that are presented, and ultimately we have a real problem, because one party, which commands has a built-in 40% of the electorate, 40% of people still approve of Trump, just as they approved of 40% of people approved of Trump a year ago. 87% of Republicans still approve of Trump. So would more civic education change that? I don't know. I think it's a good thing, but I don't think it solves the fundamental problem, which is the way that our political conflict and narratives are playing out, and the fact that one party, the Republican Party, is just antithetical to a long tradition of liberal democracy and tolerance. And until we solve that problem, it seems like a lot of other things that we're trying to do are taking buckets to a flood when the levees have broken.
I guess I'll just say one quick, one slightly provocative, response to Lee. I think we want to be careful not to confuse the marginal Trump voter with the core Trump voter. So yeah, I mean, there is a set of the electorate that, I'll use that highly provocative word, is deplorable, right? That no matter what Trump did would never disapprove. But that's clearly not who the marginal person is, right? There's a little bit of endogeneity with identifying with Republican and improving with Trump in these polls, right? That, I don't think we need to, those people are there, they've always been there, right? So if you grew up Catholic, you learn this word irredeemability, right? That there's a certain sense in which maybe that's just true, right? So, I don't worry that much about those people. I worry more about the people that you can, bring around. So to bring back actually the point that Jamila made earlier, a shout out for someone who's not in the room. Hari Hahn is doing this amazing work with this church on racial and partisan reconciliation in the Midwest. So it was just written up in the New Republic, right? Those sorts of things, right? Figuring out how to take those marginal people, right? And I'm trying to do something similar, though, is typical. Hari's doing it in a better, more interesting way, right? To bring people together and try to move some of those people who are on the margin, because I think that's the key, right? Figuring out, right? Keep in mind, even at the very end, lots of Republicans still approved of Richard Nixon, right? When it was clear he'd done really bad stuff, right? The point is moving enough of those people in the middle to change the outcome.
Okay, so we have 1 minute and 8 people on the list. And so that's probably going to be hopeless. What I think I can do is I'll go down the list. If you have a 15-second comment, please give it, and then we'll take the rest of the discussion during our coffee break. Dee Dee, you were next. Okay. Theta?
One of the things that I have observed is that political science and social science in general would be well advised to move away from analyzing national aggregate opinion polls with questions of murky meaning thrown at millions of people treated as sacks, potatoes in a sack. In the 19th century, it was understood that the public opinion that matters in politics is organized and networked public opinion. And if you look at that, it's a very different picture than the national polls. And I'll just make one quick point building on Larry. Since 2016, the Affordable Care Act has become much more popular than unpopular, and much more popular than Donald Trump. And that didn't happen because one of the two major political parties started talking truthfully about it. The Democrats have never done that. It happened because hundreds, thousands of grassroots groups organized, informed themselves about where to go to talk, to contact their representatives, wrote op-eds for local media, held events, and educated Americans about what was actually in the Affordable Care Act.
Sid?
I would just say to Matt, I have two brother-in-laws who voted for Trump. Neither of them are deplorable, but they are definitely incorrigible. and I think they're good examples of how this Republican base is really locked in. I'm sorry we're out of time, Nicholas, because I loved your comparison between the French and the American election, and I'd love to hear more analysis of Macron and whether there are any lessons. I know the systems are very different. Whether there are any lessons from what Macron did or how he's governed that the Democrats might learn from.
Radu?
I would just like to ask about the Democratic Party, because we didn't talk about that specifically much, especially as Mr. Drutman said about the creation of ethnic identity. That Ta-Nehisi Coates may have said now that Trump is the first white president, but the Republican Party was also the party of colorblind, and the Democratic Party was also one that built for a long time on different kinds of identity that were exclusionary and cleavage-based. And this is especially to Dr. Van de Waal. Do you see parallels between perpetuation and creating of separation, ethnic separation, from African polities to what has been going on in the States?
Ken?
Very briefly, I wanted to thank Jamila for her comments, your response to Kim's, which I think was very much along the lines of what I wanted to give. And I think in many ways it's the same response that E.J. Dionne gave yesterday, that the real alternative is some sort of civic renewal from below, and it has exactly to do with the kinds of civic networks and organization that Theta is talking to. And I think, for me, I don't have a whole lot of confidence I have very little confidence in the elites. I don't have a whole lot of confidence in the mass public. I do have much more confidence in the kinds of civic renewal that you're talking about, and I won't elaborate, but I've got big concerns as to how that plays out, sort of the social fabric from which the right can draw in the United States, as opposed to the social fabric that you see trying to regenerate or renew on more progressive circles in the United States, but I won't elaborate.
Yes, I was just going to comment on kind of bringing some of those together, the local media that you all had mentioned. So the change in the media, Sinclair, regulatory stuff, and what hopes you see for the local media. So it's one thing to have the civic organizations, and to what extent is information really available. So in an information-rich environment at the national level, but then at the local level, the extent to which these sorts of initiatives can really, that information can be dispersed and people can really learn about those things. So,
Peter?
So really quickly, I think my view is a slightly different take than Theta on public opinion. And one of the things that sort of surprises me so much with Trump is how out of line some of his key policies are with public opinion. So if we look at shifts in attitudes toward immigration over the last 15 years, public support for immigration and views of immigrants have become much more positive, doubling in terms of the positive outlook. So the notion of a president making that sort of a hard line stance opposite the direction of public opinion seems kind of stunning. Criminal justice is another example. So for the last 2 decades, as the crime rate has been going down, we can observe that how punitive the public is, although still punitive, has also been going down. The public's less punitive, and that's a 2-decade trajectory that follows a declining crime rate. So for the president to stake such a tough on crime position through it's just completely at odds with the direction of the way public opinion is going. So I think we can measure it. I think along the lines with what Larry was saying, we do find public opinion tracking, in many cases, not always, but objective conditions. And the fact that Trump is so out of step with the direction of public opinion is what I find most stunning.
That is a task for the next panel, maybe? I don't know. Thanks, everybody. Join me in thanking our panelists.